The storm had rolled into the city quietly that evening, the kind of rain that started as a drizzle and then grew heavier, covering the sidewalks in a shimmering silver glaze. The corporate tower stood tall against the night sky, its glass walls reflecting the city lights and the streams of water trickling down like tears. Inside, the building was nearly empty. Floors that buzzed with voices and footsteps during the day were silent now, their hallways echoing only with the hum of fluorescent lights. Down in the lobby, a man pushed a mop steadily across the floor. His name was David, and though he blended into the background for most, he carried a weight far heavier than the mop in his hands. His uniform was simple, his shoes worn from long shifts, and his face bore lines of exhaustion, but his eyes, deep brown and filled with quiet determination, spoke of a man who kept going no matter how hard life pressed him down. For years, David had worked the late shift as a janitor, a job that others might overlook but one that put food on the table for his daughter, Emily. She was 7 years old, with a laugh that made his heart lighter and a smile that reminded him of his late wife. 2 years ago, tragedy had taken her away in a car accident that still haunted him every time he closed his eyes. Since then, Emily had become his anchor, his reason for waking up, his reason for surviving. Every night before leaving for work, he kissed her forehead as she slept, whispering promises that tomorrow would be brighter, that he would never let anything happen to her. He carried her photo in his wallet, pulling it out during breaks when the loneliness became unbearable. That night, as he mopped the shining marble floors, his thoughts drifted to Emily's school project due the next week. She wanted to build a model of the solar system, and she had begged him to help her with it. He had smiled, promising they would do it together over the weekend. The promise kept him going as he wrung out the mop and glanced out through the large glass doors at the parking lot shimmering with rain. Out there, walking briskly with an umbrella, was Claire. She was the CEO of the company, known for her poise, her iron will, and her reputation for never slowing down. She was the kind of woman who commanded rooms with her presence, who signed million-dollar contracts with the flick of a pen, and whose sharp heels echoed with authority down the hallways. People admired her, but most kept their distance. Claire had built her life on control and power, but it had cost her the one thing she never admitted to anyone: closeness. Her days were packed with meetings, decisions, and deadlines, but when she returned to her penthouse apartment at night, the silence felt colder than she let on. She hurried toward her car, her thoughts still half on the emails she needed to review before bed. Her sleek sedan gleamed under the rain, waiting for her like a loyal servant. She barely noticed the man leaning casually against a dark sedan a few spaces away. He seemed ordinary at first glance, but David noticed him. From the lobby, his eyes locked on the stranger, studying his posture. There was something in the way the man shifted his weight, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hands slipped repeatedly into his coat pocket. It was subtle, but David had learned to read people, to sense when something was wrong. Years ago, before life had turned him into a janitor, he had worked odd jobs, construction, security, anything that paid. And though he never spoke about it, he had once been in situations where danger announced itself not with words, but with body language. Tonight, every instinct screamed at him. Claire reached for her car door, the keys clinking softly as she pressed the unlock button. The lights of the car blinked once. David's pulse surged. He dropped the mop, the wet handle clattering against the tiles, and sprinted toward the glass doors. Bursting into the storm, his voice tore through the rain like thunder. "Don't get in the car." The words echoed in the parking lot. Claire froze, turning sharply, her eyes narrowing in annoyance. For a moment, all she saw was the janitor, the man she barely noticed during boardroom dinners, the one she passed in the lobby without so much as a nod. Why was he yelling at her? But before she could demand an explanation, the stranger moved. From the corner of her eye, she saw him lunge. His hand shot out of his coat, and in it was a rag soaked in something that stung the air even through the rain. The acrid, chemical smell hit her nose, chloroform. Time slowed, her body refusing to react fast enough. David didn't hesitate. He threw himself between her and the attacker, slamming into the man with a force that knocked both of them to the ground. The rag fell, landing inches from Claire's heels, the fumes wafting up as rain splattered against it. Claire stumbled backward, her heart hammering, unable to comprehend what had almost happened. The two men wrestled violently on the wet pavement. David grunted as fists connected, the attacker fighting with a desperate, ruthless energy. But David fought harder, fueled not by skill alone, but by the fire of a man who had already lost once and refused to lose again. Within moments, security guards rushed in, drawn by the shouting. They pinned the attacker down just as police sirens began to wail in the distance. The rag was bagged as evidence, and the man was dragged away, shouting curses into the night. Claire stood frozen, the realization sinking in. If David hadn't seen, hadn't acted, she would have been gone. Rain soaked through her clothes, her hair clinging to her face, her expensive shoes ruined. She sat on the curb, trembling, unable to stop her tears. Beside her, David stood breathing heavily, his knuckles bruised, his uniform clinging to his body. He looked down at her, not with triumph, but with quiet steadiness, as though saving her had been instinct, not choice. "You saved my life," Claire whispered, her voice breaking in a way she hadn't allowed in years. David shook his head. "I just did what anyone would do." But Claire knew better. Most people would have looked away. Most people would have stayed silent. She stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time, not as the janitor she passed by, but as a father, as a protector, as a man who had risked everything for someone he barely knew. In the days that followed, Claire couldn't shake the image of that night. She replayed it again and again. The shout, the rag, the rain, the way David clutched the photo of his daughter afterward as if to remind himself why he had fought. She called him into her office one afternoon. He looked uncomfortable in the leather chair across from her desk, his rough hands folded in his lap. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly, a question that had lingered in her since that night. David pulled out the small, worn photo of Emily, holding it carefully between his fingers. Her smile lit up the picture, her missing front teeth making her look both innocent and strong. His voice was steady but tinged with sadness as he said, "Because I know what it feels like to lose someone. I couldn't let that happen again. Not to anyone, not if I could stop it." For a long moment, the room was silent. Claire felt her chest tighten. In his words, she heard more than explanation, she heard the echo of love, grief, and resilience. She thought of her own life, filled with accomplishments but devoid of warmth, of someone waiting for her at home. She realized something she had forgotten. Success was empty without connection, without courage, without humanity. Moved in a way she couldn't quite put into words, Claire decided to act. She arranged for David to be recognized, not just with a ceremony but with a promotion that lifted the burden he carried. His new role came with better pay, better hours, and the chance to be home earlier for Emily. At first, David resisted. He wasn't used to recognition, to being seen. But when he told Emily, her face lit up, and that was enough for him to say yes. Weeks later, Claire stood by her office window, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. She thought of David, of Emily, of that night when her world almost ended but instead began to change. She understood now that heroes don't always wear suits or sit in corner offices. Sometimes, they carry mops, wear worn sneakers, and fight storms because love gives them no other choice. And in that truth, she found something she hadn't in years: hope.